Well, hello everyone and welcome back. I am Christina from myosh and I'm absolutely thrilled to be hosting part 2 of our critical risk webinar series in partnership with FEFO Consulting. Now, last week in part 1, Work Imagined, we explored how to design safer work before it begins, looking at high energy hazards and the importance of selecting the right critical controls. Now, today we're going to be shifting into action. This session is called Work Done, Verifying Safety Where It Matters Most. Because planning controls is one thing, but verifying they're working in the field is in real time is where the rubber really hits the road. Now, we've got two fantastic presenters with us today. First up is Terry Swanton, Director at FEFO Consulting. Now, Terry brings decades of hands-on safety experience with a strong focus on making critical control management practical, scalable, and effective. Joining him is the fabulous Nicole Copeland from Puma Energy. Nicole is a highly respected business leader with over 25 years of experience across engineering, construction, energy, infrastructure, and retail. She currently leads HSSE for the Asia Pacific region at Puma Energy, helping to align safety, sustainability, and ESG priorities across environments. Just a quick reminder, this is an interactive session and your voice matters. So please use that chat box throughout the session to ask questions, share your comments, or even drop in your own experiences. We're going to do our very best to answer them. However, we probably will be making those answers at the end of the session. So just continue to add them in as we go. All right, let's get into it. Please join me in welcoming Terry and Nicole.
Thanks so much, Christina, and what an intro. It's the first time that someone said the word decades when introducing me. I'm feeling very old, but thank you for that.
Good reason, though.
Exactly. And Nicole, thanks so much for joining us. I'm really excited to hear some of your stories today because you've got such an interesting journey to where you've got to at this point at Puma in the APAC region. So we will kick off. We've got a lot to get through. And like Christina was saying, that we're going to hold the questions to the end because we want to make sure we're getting through all the content because there's some really great takeaways for you from this one. So just a really quick bit about us. So FEFO Consulting, we are a purpose-driven consultancy firm based across all states of Australia. And what we do is we work with organisations that really do value safety. And we work across the critical control management space, but we're also doing things from, strategy, leadership, management systems, everything. So this week we're looking at critical risk work as done. So verifying critical control effectiveness. Last week we looked at the critical work imagined. And just a special shout out to Bradley Brooks and also Gareth Parker for leading that one. I thought they did a fantastic job. So like Christina said, the verifying critical control effectiveness is such a critical part of this whole program, pun absolutely intended. If we're only identifying, we're only doing half the job. We're not doing the part that really does make the rubber hit the road, and that's what the focus will be today. So just a quick recap on last week's webinar. So this is a 3-part series, as mentioned earlier. If you did miss it, feel free to go to the YouTube page for myosh, which is a great resource, or you could go through to Spotify as well, which is a good one if you're traveling to listen to these podcasts. So in the first one, we looked at identifying high energy hazards. So the team introduced the concept of a high energy control assessment as an option to monitor the presence of safeguards. They also discussed the importance of understanding the precursors to material unwanted events. And then they looked at the benefits for identifying critical controls and highlighted the importance of simplicity as well. So it's really important that we identify these critical controls. We make sure we're doing it not just from behind the desk in the office, we're getting out there, we're understanding the work. But once we've done that work, making sure that it's as simple as possible for our end user. So quite often in safety, we forget the end user experience. And that's one thing that we always try and drive at FEFO is around what is the product for the end user going to be? And we need to make sure that it's simple and effective and easy to be picked up. We're going to kick off with a poll because we love engagement from the get-go. So this is an interesting question, and there is a reason why we're asking this one. It links to risk perception. So I want you to have a think about, what is the greater risk? Is it A, swimming at a patrolled surf beach between the flags, or B, swimming at an uncontrolled flat body of water? So people are answering quite quickly on this one, which is interesting. So I want you to give it a bit of thought around, if you're entering the water, what are some of the hazards? What are some of the controls for each one of those? We'll give you...
It's quite skewed at the moment.
Mm.
We've got 25 responses in there, so I'll wait a little bit longer if everyone could take a second to answer that.
Yeah, it's looking quite interesting, isn't it? So, like I said before, we will talk about risk perception a little bit later in today's presentation, but I always find this one a really good icebreaker question to ask a team.
I'll just wait 2 more seconds. All right. I'm going to close that off.
Before we go...
do you want the results now or after?
Just after, thanks. Before we jump into the results, I'd like to ask Nicole what your answer for this one would be and why.
Thanks, Terry, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here. First of all, Terry, I thought this one was interesting. You're asking someone who was born and raised in Canada, where we skate on ice more than we swim in the water. Plus, I'm part of that generation that was traumatized by the movie Jaws. So it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that, from my perspective, the bigger risk is actually swimming in that uncontrolled flat body of water. First instance for me, even though it's calm and it looks a bit safe and, there's no waves, but it can really be deceptive. For me, I want the lifeguards. I want to be able to see what's out there. I want warning signs. I want somebody to be able to help if I get into trouble. Even though the calm, flat water looks really inviting, you don't really know what's happening underneath, the currents, the depths, the wriggly grass that could wrap around your feet, any number of things. I would definitely say that the calm, flat water is the one that I find the higher risk, and probably has to do as well with living about 17 years in Queensland, where now I'm more scared of stonefish in flat water than a shark at the beach. But I do think it's a great reminder of what we're talking about today, and that's, risk can be less obvious sometimes, and someone can really get hurt when you don't expect it. So just like in many of our operations, it's not always the noisy, high energy work that catches us out. Sometimes it's the routine, the familiar, the flat water tasks where the controls are missing, and then we can easily take it for granted.
Yeah, great answer, and thanks for explaining. It's really interesting, isn't it, when we look at our upbringing, so our cultural, influences, our environmental influences, and as you said there, living in Canada, you're obviously doing a lot more skating than swimming, I think, a lot of the time, but for me, it's the exact opposite. So I grew up in the water, surfing and doing all sorts of activities out in surf beaches. So I often look at this is going to be controversial, but I often look at between the flags for me as an increased risk, because when I'm out there, if I'm surfing, for example, that's where there is a lot of people, and a lot of people without the experience and the knowledge. And there's a lot more unknowns there, even though it is in the flags. So for me, that can be a more dangerous area that I'll try and avoid. But then I understand as well that if you're swimming in an unpatrolled flat body of water, then there's potentially no supervision from a qualified lifeguard. So that's a really interesting one. How did we go, Christina, with the results?
So taking into account the few answers that we got in the chat box as well, about 70% of us are saying swimming at an unpatrolled flat body of water, versus the 30%. I picked that one too. Versus the 30% swimming at the patrolled surf beach between the flags.
Very interesting, because I would think that a lot of the answers may be around supervision and having the lifeguards there, but how do we know those lifeguards are going to do what they're intended to do? So we start thinking about verifying controls. Yes, the lifeguards are there. Are they fit for work? Are they supervising effectively? Are they doing all the things that we're expecting them to do? Hopefully, but potentially not as well. So again, there's a lot of variables that go into this, but it's just a really good exercise to do to start getting the brain thinking and talking to your teams around risk perception, which plays such a huge role. So we'll move forward. So for the agenda for today, today's webinar is going to be broken down into 3 parts. So the first part being prioritising control assurance activity. Then second part being detecting early warning signs. And finally, human and organisational factors. So we'll kick off with the first component. So prioritising control assurance activity. It is so important that we make sure that we're prioritising and working in the right space for the context we're working in. So often organisations have no plan for how they intend to provide assurance to the organisation. Some organisations have a generic approach, which increases the risk of not focusing on the right areas, whilst other organisations, they might try to do it all without an adequate plan and adequate resources, and this can reduce the level of effectiveness, and it can lead to a bit of a box ticking exercise, which I'm sure many of us may have seen that in our careers, where the assurance activities don't seem to be adding value. It seems to be a last minute thing and we're just ticking boxes. So why is prioritising so important? Well, it allows us to focus on what matters, and that's the whole premise of critical control management, focusing on what matters most. It allows us to validate that the critical controls are implemented and effective. It supports the legal and due diligence activities, and it drives continuous improvement, and it also helps with that culture around safety as well. So when we're looking at our priorities, is it a conscious choice? So we need to challenge ourselves to consider whether priorities are, deliberately chosen, or potentially they're ad hoc, or maybe they're chosen for you. So we need to understand, what are our material unwanted events? Where do the relevant assurance activities sit? And also, who owns them is a really important one. We see a lot of organisations do a lot of work at the front end, but they can sometimes fall over by not understanding who's responsible and communicating that and making sure that that's followed through as well. So as you can see here, we've got a table which follows the plan, do, check, act cycle, and this links to key activities for each phase. So if we're looking at the plan phase, we've got leadership considerations, risk management, and resource allocation, which set the foundation. The do phase, that focuses on operational competencies, communication, documentation, and procurement. The check phase involves incident management and investigations, emergencies, audits, and assurance processes, while the act phase emphasises management review, learning, and corrective actions. And I just want to point out here that this slide also highlights the flow from operational activities through to control assurance activities, so such as critical control verifications. But I think it's important to point out that high-performing organisations don't wait for a specific check to be done. So rather than waiting for an assurance activity that's formalised, high-performing organisations, their teams are doing these day in, day out because it's ingrained in their operations. So they may not be following a checklist as such and doing the formal process which is coming, but in their operations, they're aware of what those critical controls are, and they're always looking and verifying and have that heightened awareness. So I'll throw to Nicole. Could you give an example of how you or your organisation has prioritised assurance activities in the past?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll go to some past and current later, but I think one example that comes to mind from my experiences, particularly on the production side of resources, where we had multiple compliance assurance activities happening very closely and sometimes overlapping: audits, inspections, compliance checks. And to be honest, we were getting feedback from the workforce, about exhaustion around it and a lot of duplication efforts, and where was it actually adding value. So in that particular instance, I'm thinking of, we took a step back, prioritized, and asked, what are the activities that are actually giving us insight into the effectiveness of our critical controls? And of course, critical controls in different industries, and once upon a time they were referred to as different language, but critical controls as we know it today. then I think we took the real strategic mindset or shift. We shifted our effort towards, those away from the low value tick in the box type of auditing, or at least as much as possible. Sometimes it was externally required, and really honed in on the focus of critical control verifications, especially around high energy work. The big hurdle in that was more cultural than anything, mostly because leaders and people within the compliance and auditing part of the businesses were very comfortable with the way that they had already and always done it, because it gave them a sense of control, and so it was the challenge of overcoming that. So to do that, we really went to the front line and built it backwards. We involved the operations team in designing what should the verification approaches look like, and then linked it to how we were going to directly prevent any type of serious incidents from occurring. And that's production, but construction's slightly different. I mean, a similar thing I tried to do in construction and learned very quickly. It was a different challenge, similar but different challenge, because in that instance we had really restrained or stretched resources for assurance, so we didn't have enough to be able to go out and do as much auditing as we would like. So in that particular instance, we took a risk-based approach again, so the same outcome but for different reasons, and again prioritizing what was going to give us the biggest leverage. So looking at things like sim ops, confined space work, and then scaling back checks on lower risk activities, that was really how we handled that one. I guess my takeaway from both the examples is that you can't assure everything, but strategic choices are probably the really important piece there. Focus on where failure matters most, and that's going to be different. It's going to be different in different industries. It's going to be different in different countries, different cultures, different regulatory environments. So that my advice would be really use the workforce, the knowledge. Those are the people that know where the point of risk is at. Simplify your assurance activities as much as possible without compromising the value of it. Keep the people that know it closest to it, especially the verification process.
Absolutely. I think the context you're working in is absolutely critical, and really understanding the business and understanding the key risks. You've got to do that work at the front end as well, don't you, to fully understand what you're up against. And one thing that I like what you said there was around, it reminded me of being a new safety person in a role in an organization, and rather than just accepting the norm I think you need to be brave and ask questions. So to get in there and say, well, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? And obviously doing it the right way. But what advice would you give a safety person going into a brand new organization? They've got a critical control program and assurance program. What advice would you give them?
Going in, I would definitely say the most important thing is to listen and learn, absorb, because just because it might be something new to you doesn't mean that it doesn't have immense value. So I think understanding the context, understanding the history, and then being able to use your very clear lens, right? Your fresh way of thinking, your fresh way of looking at things, to ask lots of questions, and plant seeds for change, and then working with people around you who have a similar mindset or growing into what it is that you might want to actually accomplish, and again leveraging that to be able to make some change. But definitely I would say, particularly when you're moving into larger organizations, being able to look at where you can have that impact on shifting how the work is done, or maybe even doing a proof of concept in a particular place, and growing it from there. I've found that to be really, really helpful, taking a particular area that's quite diverse, dynamic, lots of different risks, and testing out your theories, testing out your methodology, and getting some movement on what type of impact it has, getting some metrics on what type of impact it has, and then you can really show that value and start spreading it across the rest of the business. It can be a great differentiator in your career as well.
Absolutely. It's a great way to get points with operations too, when they see someone who's listening rather than just coming in and hitting control paste, because you do see that from time to time. People will take what's worked in another organization and plonk it into their new organization, but without doing that really important work at the front end, they can sometimes set themselves up for failure as well. So really critically important. So we've got some examples here of some typical assurance activities. So For those of you who may not be aware of the first, second, and third line and fourth line of defence, I'll give you a quick introduction to those. But on the left-hand side there, we've got common assurance activities, so critical control verifications, permit checks, SWIMS reviews, system or ISO audits, and compliance reporting. And we've mapped out some examples of where that might sit. But the first line of defence, so this is often the frontline workers. That could be supervisors, line managers, and their role is often to manage the day-to-day risks and often to own those risks on site. The second line of defence is often the WHS professional in the organisation or the team of professionals. It could also be quality in that context, or environmental as well. Their role should be to support, advise, coach, but also play a key role in monitoring as well. The third line is usually the internal assurance team, usually led by risk or the compliance function. And their role is to provide independent assurance that the first two lines are working. And of course, finally, the last line there is the external assurance. So third-party auditors, insurers, regulators, consultants like us, we do it all the time. And their role is to provide external validation and hold the organisation to account. But also there's such an opportunity here to share learnings as well, which is often missed. So another question for you, Nicole. Does all assurance activity in your experience add value to the work that's being done?
Not all assurance activity, from my experience, adds value to the work being done. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes it can be a significant distraction, or it can actually impact your safety culture, because the people that you're out there with who are actually doing the work start to get frustrated and see it as, not exactly a great use of their time. So being able to have, risk-based, targeted at critical controls, that sort of mentality, that can really help shift from broad compliance audits to more focus on, as we mentioned earlier, high energy controls, and transforming insurance, most importantly, into a learning activity. That is the most important thing. I find that assurance activities that have the greatest return on investment is when you turn the moments that you're actually there at site or at the workplace into a conversation about what's not working, why it's not working, and then soliciting the ideas from the people of what can the organization do better, what systems can be better, and what can they do better as well. And so I think that's one way in which, not all assurance activities are equal. Yeah, it needs to be done with purpose. It needs to be risk-based, and it needs to be connected with what's actually happening on the ground, not just paperwork.
Absolutely. And again, like I said before, it's being brave and asking the right questions and asking why are we doing this, linking it back to, like you say, like linking it back to your critical risk, linking it back to strategy, like why are we doing these things? I feel like that so often organizations, they get into this rhythm and an organizational complacency can set in, and you ask people on the ground, well, why do you do this process? Why do you do this? And they go, I don't know. We just do it. We've just been doing it for years. We've got no idea. So people on the ground need to know why as well.
Yeah, I'd add in too, don't be afraid of what you don't know. I'm not a crane operator. I'm not a welder, right? When you think of these environments that we go into, I'm not a person who works in a warehouse. So going out and assessing, the effectiveness of that type of work environment, asking questions, being curious, and never pretend what you don't know. Be vulnerable, right? And they are the experts in what they do, and that's how you will gain that relationship where you'll be able to see more of what's happening. But also, too, it increases that ability to be able to exchange ideas. You will learn from them. They, too, will learn from you.
Absolutely. That's such a good reminder to all safety people on the call that we often feel like we have to be the expert in everything, and we just can't. And that's why we've got these people in these roles with, the right experience, right qualifications that we just have to lean on. We just can't know everything, and we shouldn't know everything either. All right, we'll move forward to the second section here, which is detecting early warning signs. So detecting the early warning signs are critical for critical control management, again, pun intended, because it allows organisations to intervene before a failure occurs, allowing us to prevent serious incidents or fatalities or some other catastrophic events. What it should do is prevent control failures before they escalate, It supports a proactive safety culture. It improves risk visibility, which is a absolutely important function. It can help fight against complacency. So as you can see, we've got a poll that we're going to jump into. And the question we've got here is, does your organisation have methods to verify critical risk controls as present or present and effective?
Everybody's answering this one quite quickly. Pardon me. I'll just wait a little bit longer for you guys to respond to that. If you could all take 2 seconds to do that. Some incredible information you guys have been sharing. Thank you so much. Everyone's going to get so much out of this. I'll wait 2 more seconds. A few more answers.
This is looking quite interesting.
Yeah, look, yes. Interesting and a little bit scary, I think. All right. Oh, let's stop that one there. So in answer to your question, does your organisation have methods to verify critical risk controls as present or present and effective? The majority at about 76% are saying they're just present, not present and effective, which came in at 24%. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't think it to be that one-sided. So it makes me a little bit nervous as well. And a few people on the call, once they've thought about that question, they might be feeling a little bit nervous because, you know, we've seen the controls as present, but we haven't yet gone to that next stage to go, but is it effective? And you see it a lot where organizations haven't even thought about this question, let alone done any planning around how do we make sure that this is effective? What are your thoughts, Nicole?
I think, you know, it can be a quick win to get present controls in place, and you know, it's usually based on historical experience, historical performance, research, but then testing whether or not it's effective with your workplace, at your work site, with your particular processes is another thing. And quite frankly, having been there, it can be a bit scary because, you know, some of these things, especially if we've put significant costs into engineering controls or major system changes, only to potentially find out that it's not as good as we thought. So that can be intimidating to move into that stage, and it's far more time consuming involved, and being able to pull data from it. And that's the other thing. We all want data, but it's not something that's always as easily attainable. It takes a lot of effort. So to me, it's almost the version of tick and flick. You can make it present really easy, but the harder yards is whether or not it's really effective. And if it isn't, even harder again is that conversation about, well, it didn't quite go as planned.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we often learn that the hard way, don't we? After an incident, we learn that the controls that we had actually weren't that effective. So yeah, it's a little bit scary, that one. So have you got any advice for people on the call around understanding effectiveness, or any examples of what you've done in your previous roles?
I think probably, again, the best thing to do would be, it's a combination of experience around the different disciplines as well across your business. So I talk a lot about, you know, working with the people at the point of risk or on the front line, but also too engaging with your procurement, your supply chain, your HR teams. You know, that's the cross-sectional piece where you can really get an idea about how to look at effectiveness more holistically. So, you know, that is, I think, one piece of advice I would add in, but also don't be afraid of the fact that the effectiveness checks that you're doing might need continual improvement. So it might be that your first draft of how you look at it, you continually evolve. You know, what you're looking at today may not be the way you're going to look at it in 12 months' time. So that would be my advice.
Absolutely. And I've seen a comment come through from Andrew here saying that Verify needs to be a consultative process, not just managed by senior management in an office.
Absolutely.
And completely agree. So we don't want to be sitting back and having a gut feel that things are effective. We need to be engaging the workforce, asking the right questions, but also really understanding, like, what does effective mean? And I think that's often missed, is we think they're effective because we haven't got any data or any process to verify that. So we go back to our old ways and go, well, there's been no incident, I've had no hazard report, so it must be effective. And in these high risk environments, we just can't rest with that. We need to be able to verify. We'll move forward. So this one's quite interesting. So why focus on early warning signs? So the data you can see on the screen here comes from what seems to be the first published study that reports the reliability of critical risk controls in construction. So you can see here we've got mobile equipment, lifting operations, stored energy, and working at heights. In the black, we've got the average critical control implementation score. And then we've got in the grey colour, the average critical control effectiveness. So with this study, I've got some data here which I'll go through. This study analysed 10 years of serious and fatal incident investigation reports from 4 international construction companies. Their intention was to assess the reliability of their critical controls and also assess the factors that impact the reliability of the critical controls. The results show the reliability of critical controls measured by the implementation and effectiveness averaged just 42%. So 3 out of the 4 topics that you can see here had a lower score for critical control effectiveness versus implementation. So quick question for you, Nicole. What comes to mind when you see this data?
I think when I see the data, it's interesting. People always say I'm overly optimistic, and it's always been my Achilles heel, but we tend to overestimate how reliable our critical controls often are. So on paper, it looks solid, but when you test it in reality, it doesn't always turn out the way that you thought. Some examples come to mind, in construction times on major greenfield projects where I can remember an incident where scaffolding controls were signed off as compliant. But during the routine verification process, they discovered that there was missing ties that reduced the stability at the time. And the paperwork said the control was effective, but in practice, it wasn't. And that's exactly what these figures remind me of, right? Is the gap between what's assumed and what's actually effective. And same thing with logistics and transport. I think about journey management for drivers. We spend a lot of time on that, right? But when we dug deep, even though we were getting all these JMPs done, the reality was less than half of them were actually being followed while they were driving. And the data sort of exposed that false sense of security that we thought we were covered on, but in reality, that wasn't the case. So definitely verifying things in real conditions is the extra thing I would add in as well, not just in test dummy situations.
Yeah, we had a conversation recently around the 3 out of the 4, so mobile equipment, lifting operations, and working at heights. So obviously they've all got the high percentage around implementation versus effectiveness. But then the odd one out there being stored energy. What were your thoughts on this being the outlier? So stored energy, the percentage being higher for critical control effectiveness versus, say, mobile plant?
I think, when I looked at that one, again, it's people's perception, right? And risk tolerance. And working with stored energy is something that a select few, or at least the minority of your workforce, often deal with. You're talking about your high voltage electricians, your operators, for example, when you think of stored energy. So I think people's risk tolerance with that idea is much lower than perhaps some of the other things that are more common, and many other people are involved in the activities. So driving a forklift, for example, jumping in and out of that, 20, 30 times a day at a warehouse, lifting operations, particularly if it's a crane that's fixed and installed and is used every day to be able to lift goods. So I think that, to be honest with you, it comes down to people's perception around it, about whether or not, it's effective. So that's where I'm coming from, but could have other different perspectives on it out there, I'm sure.
Exactly. And one of the things that I thought of too was, what role does complacency play here? So those that are working around stored energy, is their level of complacency much lower than people working around plant equipment? That might come into play as well.
Absolutely.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to revisit the case study that was presented last week by Gareth and Brad. So if those of you who are on the call missed last week, please go back on YouTube or Spotify and have a look at the first webinar. We're going to talk about the HECA element here, and just a quick reminder around what is HECA. So HECA is defined as the percentage of high energy hazards with a corresponding direct control. HECA is built on the concept that safety performance is best measured as the control of high energy hazards. So looking at this case study, which was presented last week, 9 high energy hazards were observed, and some of these, which included suspended loads, the side boom tipping or tracking, swinging loads, other vehicle traffic, power lines, compressed gas. This case study looked at this in a bit more detail, and what we found there was 5 of the 9 hazards had effective direct controls. So these controls met strict criteria, and that's a really important one to remember for those of you listening, is around the strict criteria. So they've done the work and identifying what that is. Targeted, effective, and resilient to human error. So they had direct controls that met strict criteria, they were targeted, they were effective, and resilient to human error. So there's human factors there, which we'll talk about later. The examples of effective controls included engineered cribbing for supported pipe, safe operating limits for side boom tipping, properly installed rigging for cable and pulley systems, de-energized power lines near the work zone. I'll scroll down. And they also inspected and secured gas cylinders. 4 hazards lacked direct controls, and these were no physical barricades or energy mitigation, operations vulnerable to human error, and examples, swinging loads, vehicle traffic, and side boom tracking. So the takeaways from the study here was only 56% of life-threatening hazards were effectively controlled using the HECA methodology. Direct controls must be engineered, verified, and resilient to human error. This case study showed how HECA helps us see beyond compliance and focus on what truly prevents serious harm. And it highlights we need to close the gap on 44% of the hazards still exposed. So using the HECA methodology, as was introduced last week in webinar 1, it gives us a real-time view of safety, not just after something goes wrong. A little while ago, at the start of the presentation, we spoke about risk perception. So it's a really interesting topic. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through these 4 elements here, and we'll give you a bit more information. So risk perception is shaped by a mix of psychological, social, cultural, contextual factors. It's not about the facts, it's how people feel about risk often matters more than the actual probability. So these 4 areas we're going to look at, we'll start with the first one there being the context and the environment. So risk perception is shaped by the physical and situational context. For example, a noisy, high pressure work site may reduce the worker's ability to detect or respond to hazards. Environmental cues like warning signs, lighting, or layout can either amplify or downplay the perceived risk. And we must design these environments that supports accurate risk awareness. The next one there is psychological factors. So people don't assess risk purely rationally. We're influenced by past emotions, past experiences, and cognitive bias. And I believe that you've got a couple of stories for us coming up soon, Nicole, around cultural differences. You know, for instance, if someone has never been hurt by doing a risky task, they may underestimate the danger. And you look at kids, they don't understand the risk. They definitely do interesting behaviours until they learn. There could be some fear, overconfidence. You could be really familiar with the environment and the risk. So it's all around how you perceive risk. This is why training and reflection are just so important. They can help recalibrate our risk perception. The third one we're going to look at is the social and cultural influences. So risk perception is also shaped by group norms. It could be your team norms as well, cultural values. If the team culture says, let's just get the job done no matter what, people might downplay the safety concerns that are being raised. And then in some cultures, questioning the authority or speaking up about a risk may be discouraged. So what we've got to try and do is build cultures where safety is a shared value and not a personal choice. But we need to understand what some of these perceptions and biases may be. Is individual differences. So each person brings their own personality, experience, and risk tolerance. Some are naturally cautious, others are more risk tolerant. There's age, training, fatigue plays a factor. Even people's mental health and how they present on that given day or time period could be a factor that influences how someone perceives and responds to risks. So that's why it's really important for all of us on the call to make sure that our communication is tailored and supervision is there as well. So Nicole, you've got some interesting experience in cultural differences and risk perception. Would you be happy to share a story?
Yeah, I think, I think for me, risk perception and critical controls, that it really comes to mind around how different people can judge the same risk, right? And that definitely includes different cultural backgrounds, different countries, different regulatory environments, and even coming from different industries. I mean, certainly something we experience in Australia is ebbs and flows in different resource sectors or in different industry sectors where, I've had experiences working in coal seam gas where we've had to bring in workers who formerly worked in agriculture, and the risk perception of people who work in the gas industry and agriculture, and really getting that exposure was quite a learning for me at that time. But even within the work that we're doing, I see oftentimes teams consistently underestimating the risk of the work. And I think of something like working at height. I think about current environment as an example, working at height where in a production facility that can be just considered a regular part of routine maintenance. So the focus is really on the task or the maintenance activity itself, and overlooking the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, a missed anchor point or an unsecured lanyard, that's actually a critical control. But the perception after the fact was, well, that was just normal work. That wasn't non-routine work. It's low risk, and in reality, obviously, it's a very high energy hazard. And then, my mind goes to retail stations in retail businesses in working in Papua New Guinea as an example versus Australia, and where we experience things like incivility or customer aggression. Very different perspectives, on how that's taken and at what point you instigate controls and reach out for help. So, you're talking about one environment where, security is a significant issue on a daily basis. But from a local perspective, the habituation to that type of security risk is there. Whereas me as an expat, for example, coming in country, I have a very heightened sense around it. And it's really interesting conversations to somewhere how meet in the middle between, the people that are working in that situation, how they perceive it, and how myself, as a governance and assurance person, wants them to perceive it. So it is really interesting, and there's a lot of different variables. I guess my point is you just have to be very respectful of the fact of bringing people along the journey, and again, digging into why do they think the way they do, and how can we respectfully and incrementally change that so that it then influences their behaviors at the workplace.
Yeah, great. And thanks for sharing. It's such an interesting to hear about the differences in, like, for example, Papua New Guinea versus Australian operations, but it doesn't have to be so so stark as well. It could even be the differences in one team to another. Like I find there's differences in regional areas. So you might be looking at one part of Melbourne or Sydney versus another part, the differences in those team cultures, their backgrounds as well, that can all influence risk perception at the workplace as well. So critically important that that's considered by the safety professionals and the organisation, but also
sorry, go ahead. I was going to say it's a great point, right? Because you don't need to step outside the border to realize. I mean, I'm a perfect example. I'm an immigrant, and coming in, and how I perceive things from 30 odd years in Canada versus the way in which work was done in the mines in Australia. So it's something, as you said, you don't have to look far to look for people's different backgrounds and different context.
Mm. And you can also experience this. Like I remember when I was working with an organisation, I would partner with different parts of the business to, let's take finance out to have a look at the critical controls and go through a verification activity so they can learn more about the business, and they can create the link on, why we're purchasing things or spending money here and there, and get them involved, and seeing their face when they go to site and go, we do what now? Like we're doing this day in, day out, because that's the first time they've stood in those environments a lot of the time, and they're used to being at a desk. They don't understand the risk involved, but once you start explaining and bringing people on the journey, it can definitely help close the gap. So that begs the question, how do we improve risk perception so we can reduce the risk it has? We're going to look at now a high reliability organization. So if anyone hasn't heard that term, I'll give you a quick definition. So a high reliability organization, or a HRO, is an organization that operates in a complex, high risk environment where the potential for error is high, but they manage to maintain exceptionally low rates of failure over time. But they still do have a chronic unease as well. So whilst things haven't gone wrong and they're doing really well, they have a sense of chronic unease. So if anyone wants to learn more about chronic unease, there's a really good video on our FEFO YouTube channel. But what we're going to look at here is the high reliability organization and the characteristics. So sensitivity to operations, reluctance to oversimplify, preoccupation with failure, defer to experts, and obviously resilience as well. And one of the things we're going to look at soon is the use of technology. But before we do, Nicole, have you got any examples of risk perception regarding the identification of critical risks or risk controls?
Yeah, I mean, I talked a bit about maintenance in a facility, but again, I'll go back to transport or logistics, freight and fuel transport. That's where I've seen it the opposite way, where some risks like fire extinguishers were perceived as critical. But the actual critical controls were things like ensuring that the drivers were rested and alert, and fatigue was a bigger risk. But because it was less visible, it didn't get the same attention. So, I mean, what I take from examples like that and others I've given is that risk perception can very easily bias us towards what looks dangerous rather than what actually prevents a serious incident. So that's why, to me, HROs are so effective. You build that culture of sensitivity to operations, and you have an absolute obsession with failure. Constantly asking what if or what is missing, and ensuring that we've got things verified and not just assuming it's working as we planned or we thought.
Yeah, great. So as mentioned before, we're going to look at technology. So it can play such a critical role for us. So there's a growing importance of real-time technology detection. So what I want to do is highlight three key innovations. So geospatial safety zones, wearables, which we're seeing coming more and more, becoming more achievable for all of us, and real-time image recognition. So each of these are designed to monitor and protect workers effectively. Now, what's interesting, there was a study done, and despite 96% of the industry valuing these safety technologies, only 11% are fully utilizing them, indicating that there's a significant opportunity for a broader adoption across the industry. Another question for you, Nicole, is do you have any examples of technology used within the industry that have assisted with assurance activity?
I'd love to have more, but probably one of my first that comes to mind when things like wearables and geospatial and real-time image recognition all started to come very live was during the pandemic. It's funny how necessity is the mother of invention, or at least the mother of use. I can think of with an engineering firm supporting an offshore gas sector client in Southeast Asia during COVID. And at that time, of course, we had full travel restrictions. So it meant that, we couldn't physically get to the production rigs to carry out any type of assurance activities, which normally we would have just limited it to a desktop review or audits of the documentation. But what we were able to actually do was put a business case to the client to be able to introduce things like the use of RealWear intrinsically safe cameras. And with that and getting it set up and the advent of Teams being used so much at that time, we were able to, with an experienced operator who wore the device, they were able to take us through the facility hands-on, real-time. We were able to use the P&IDs, the plot plans, the schematics to be able to remotely guide him to look through the facilities and do some of the verification work that we wanted to do, and to be able to engage one-to-one in the conversation, again, facilitating that learning and feedback loop that I talked about earlier. So that really took us well beyond a tabletop exercise, which is what most people were restricted to doing in their organizations at that time, and gave us that real live visibility of what the equipment was, what the work practices were, what controls were in place. And yeah, I think it was a really meaningful assurance activity. But what I will say is I really wish it had kept going. So it's an interesting one when we think back, because as soon as we were allowed to travel, then we reverted to the traditional form. So I do think there's a place for propagating that type of technology, and I'm sure in other instances people in their companies probably are doing it very, very well. But it's one that I think was a stroke of genius when we did it, and probably didn't get enough to keep it going. But yeah, I mean, it showed the real value of technology, and it showed that we weren't replacing human judgment, but we were just shifting traditional methods and enabling more.
Yeah, it's a great insight, and it lends to itself to the maturity that you would have had as a team, because I imagine with COVID happening at the time, taking up so much, resources and planning, it would have been really easy for your team to fall into complacency and go, oh, well, let's not worry about it. It's too hard basket. So it goes back to what we were saying before, at that chronic unease, going, well, no, we still need to do that. That's a critical activity. We've prioritized it. Let's find a way forward. Just super interesting. So we're going to change gears for a second here. So some may not consider an incident investigation as an assurance activity, but it can provide warning signs to prevent future incidents, which is what we should be looking at. So why is incident investigations an assurance activity? It can verify whether controls have worked as intended or failed. And obviously we'd like to address this well before an incident occurs, but it does provide an opportunity. It provides an evidence-based insights into the effectiveness of risk management and often leads to corrective actions that strengthen future control performance. And we can also communicate those across the organisation as well, and share learnings sometimes across industries. So when we're assessing high energy hazards, whether they're proactively or after an incident, it's essential to look at both the preventative and mitigating controls. So traditional investigation methods like ICAM tend to focus heavily on prevention and often overlook mitigation. This can create gaps in understanding on how we reduce harm when things go wrong. So as Brad mentioned last week, that we've created a tool called the Risk and Incident Factor Analysis, which is a structured approach that helps us classify contributing factors across 3 levels, being individual, team, organisational, and it gives us a really clear picture of what's going on. So if you missed that last week, that webinar, go back and have a look, and Brad explains this in great detail, which is super interesting. The last section for today is the human and organisational factors. So it's important to recognise that every organisation will have factors that limit organisational performance. This slide explores key factors that can limit the organisational performance. So what that might mean is internally, there's silos between departments such as design, construction, operations, inspection and maintenance, very support functions like HR, safety, legal, or finance. These can all create barriers to effective collaboration and information flow, so that can impact our performance. These silos can often hinder critical assurance processes and overall efficiency. But then there's also external threats and other factors. So you can see on the right-hand side there's the PESTEL framework, which includes the political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal things that can impact our strategic decisions and our operations as well. What's really important for organisations is to understand both internal and external influences. And that's essential for identifying performance bottlenecks and also developing those integrated solutions, which is what we're after. In complex environments, individuals need to be adaptive in the application of the critical controls to the situation, not just follow a black and white rule. So one of the first things we learn in safety is context is key for everything. It's the competency to apply critical controls, which is the most valuable. We need to make sure that people are competent for the work environment, so they can make sure that they're making the right decisions when things don't go exactly as planned, and that black and white approach. So making sure they've got situational awareness in complex environments and having the competency to make decisions is absolutely critical. So in the absence of an organisation providing clear direction regarding critical control deviations, failure will still occur as workers are influenced by their own perceptions. So we spoke about risk perception before. Their own risk perceptions will decide on how and whether to apply the critical control to the right standard or not. And we can't underestimate the role leadership capability plays to enable high performance. For some organisation, it's often the missing link. They're doing so much right, but they haven't addressed the leadership capability across the organisation to enable high performance. So at FEFO, we believe that the safety leadership programs are not one size fits all. Our model, which you can see on the screen here, looks at high performance leaders, making sure that we're developing those people, high performance teams, look at the organisation, so high performance organisation, and looking at the workers as individuals as well. And this is all supported by coaching for leadership as well. So it's not just a one size fits all. We need to make sure that we're understanding what capability each of those quadrants of individuals or teams need, then making sure that we're not just leaving that in the classroom, we're also providing that ongoing coaching. So I see that as a really critical part of a safety role as well, is that ongoing coaching for our operational leaders. We've got a final poll before we finish up. So the question here is which aspect of critical control management does your organisation find the most challenging? The first one there is identifying material unwanted events and critical controls. Second one is setting standards and building capability. The third one is verifying and evaluating performance, then learning and improving. And if there's something else, please feel free to put that in the chat. So while people are filling those answers, what are your thoughts, Nicole? What do you think is the most challenging part for organisations, broadly speaking?
Oh, I would say as we go down the list, it gets harder. So C and D, like we talked about earlier, quite a bit around evaluating performance, but the learning and improvement, regardless of which industry I've been in, which organization, where it originates from, learning and improvement and trying to bridge the gap between local site-based learning and improvement to company-wide improvement is one of the biggest challenges we face. One, because of the perception of people as, is it material to me? Because I'm not at a site in Bulwer in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. And two, it's a bitumen facility. It's not a retail station, as an example, petrol station. So I think the learning and improvement piece, even though the principles of what we might be talking about, and it's, it could be, again, energy isolation around low voltage electrical work. So I think one of the biggest barriers oftentimes is trying to message things in a way that transcends the work site and the industry so that we keep it with the foundation of what is the actual critical risk and what types of controls we need to put in place. It can get lost in the perception of other things.
How we go, Christina?
Yeah, so there was quite varying results here. The majority are saying verifying and evaluating performance, followed by learning and improving, then setting standard and building capability, and other and identifying material unwanted events came in as a tie at the end. In the chat box, we do have one other person saying other, which is resourcing.
Yeah, it's a great addition.
Very good.
Yeah, you can have all the processes in the world, but if you don't have the means to implement those, it's going to be tricky. And I hope that person gets their resources, because it sounds like it might be a sensitive issue at the moment. All right, so as we wrap up, so the key learnings for this one, so we've broken this down into three. So the first one there is understand all of your assurance activities and make sure that we're prioritising those. So making sure that we prioritise critical control verification. How you verify could be different. So you need to go through the work at the front end, which was explained last week. Second one there is detecting the weak signals. So understanding what risk perceptions are across your team. And that it can be as simple as doing an exercise like we did before to get the ball rolling and then build on that and have ongoing conversations around risk perceptions. And the last one there is around human and organisational factors. So making sure that you're trying to build agile leadership capability to effectively control immediate and systemic organisational contributing factors.
Terry, sorry,
yes.
Can I just chime in real quick on that last one, and especially related to the answer we got back about resourcing? I just wanted to mention with HOP organizations, right? I think one of the biggest allies I've had over the years is regardless of what position I've been in, is making that connection with your connecting functions. So again, I mentioned earlier, supply chain, finance, HR, payroll. It's amazing how many connections actually have direct impacts on safety at the work site. So getting those people to think about the decisions they make or don't make in their work every single day can actually increase your resource pool to support you. So in many instances, having the procurement team, the supply chain team, very much understanding the implications of the material specifications or the purchases that they make can really maximize your impact. And where you're not seeing it at the downstream, where you're getting a piece of kit delivered that isn't suitable, isn't safe, etc. You have these allies that work in other functions within the business that are doing that critical risk management on the front end.
Absolutely. Yeah, find out who those key people are and build your safety army around them.
Yeah.
I think that that answers a question that Mark asked earlier on in the session. He said they have a CRM program implemented by their executive team. Their workforce like it, but their middle management sort of are old school in their way of thinking. And pardon me, he's asked, are there any suggestions for bringing them around? And I think what you've just said then is getting allies around those people and making them make noise as well will help drive your message home.
Absolutely. I mean, it just thinks back to a time when I had a really serious incident where a guy working on a rig lost 3 fingers from slinging chains. And when I did the investigation, this was many years ago, it was all around mind on task. And what he explained to me was that, yes, he was distracted, but he had been away from home and he was in the middle of a personal situation where, he wasn't able to see his kids because he hadn't been paid for the last 6 weeks. And so because he wasn't paid, he wasn't paying child support, so he wasn't seeing his kids and all of this stress and then coming to work. When we actually followed it all back, we had payroll issues. So when somebody asked me in payroll, how do I impact safety? I talk about, the psychosocial aspects of it and the mental health aspects and how that can actually really have a very significant influence for people when they're actually working with something high risk. So, look for those opportunities to relate back the learnings you have from your investigations to where up in the other functions, they could do things on their end to not lead to such a negative outcome.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's amazing. You never know the impacts it can be having further down the line.
Yeah.
Just as we wrap up here, you can see on the screen that we've got some free resources for you. So the first one there is the blog, the register for webinar 3. So you can take a QR code scan of that one. We've got a critical control management guide that gives you a little bit more information, and also there's a HECA fact sheet as well. So feel free to scan those. You'll get some free resources.
Amazing. I'll also include those in the email that I send out with this recording to everybody this afternoon as well.
Fantastic. And for those of you on the call that have already got a critical control program in place and like to understand how it's performing, you can reach out to us and we offer critical control management performance assessments as well. So the goal here is to do a deep dive and really understand how that's performing versus where you want to play, and essentially going under the bonnet for each component around critical control and really finding out, how are you performing, and obviously verification. You can see on the screen there, it's often a poor performer because it's the one that hasn't been thought through or verified effectively.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Nicole, Terry. From the bottom of my heart, I appreciate all that you have gone through today and everything that you've shared with us all. Like I said, we are going to be sending out these slides as well as a recording of today's session to everybody that's registered. So if you have to jump off or if somebody that will take something from today's session, please forward that through to them. I'll also include Nicole's and Terry's contact details in the email as well. So please reach out to these guys whenever you need. If you have any questions or thoughts or want to just bounce an idea off them, I know that, including myself, we're always around and so very happy to help. So please reach out and don't forget to register for our third and final session of the series next week. There'll be a link to register to that in the email as well. Nicole, Terry, thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.